Welcome to Get the Right Job. I'm Jeff Magnuson. For this second episode, I wanted to follow up with a point that I made during the first episode about job seekers and companies being equals. And in part 2 of this episode, I will address 2 common interview questions that I get asked about pretty often, which is, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? But for now, let's just focus on the job seeker-company relationship. Now, it is important to understand that companies do not hold all of the cards when hiring. I know it feels that way. After all, they have the money you want, the role that you're presumably looking for, and the next step in your career. Not to mention the fact there's a lot of advice out there about the hoops you have to jump through in order to get an interview, and then additional things you may need to do to get an offer. But let's take a step back. What do all of these pieces of advice have in common? They are all about the job search from the job seeker's perspective and the needs that he or she has. The resume submission, interview, offer is a business transaction. And in order for a transaction to work, both sides have to be satisfied. So there is an entire other side to this dynamic, which is the company. That may seem kind of obvious, but if you think about it, it's rarely talked about. So while you have needs, so does a company. And their needs could be even more urgent than yours. So let's break down the job search process from the company's perspective. So why do they have an opening? Most likely it's for 4 reasons. Either somebody left and went somewhere else, somebody transferred to an internal role, somebody was let go from a company, or the company is growing and they need more people. Now, for most organizations, when a headcount or a new employee is needed, the hiring manager just can't say, hey, we need somebody. I'm just going to go online and hire somebody. It doesn't work that way. With the exception of some entrepreneurs or really small companies where one person can make the decision, the reality for a lot of companies out there is that even though there is a vacancy, a business case still needs to be built internally and sold up the chain so a budget can be approved for this new person. Employees are a large expense at a company. Companies are there to make money. So either they have to generate more revenues and or reduce expenses. So even though an employee just left, they still need to get approvals internally for a new employee. And these can be drawn out, very frustrating, lengthy discussions that really, from the people I speak to and my personal experience, it's never enjoyable and you really have to fight to get a head count. So there's a lot going on at a company that you may not even be aware of and they never talk about. And you've probably seen this from a slightly different angle, where if you're reading some job descriptions and a company talks about, we're a lean organization or we run lean. Essentially what that means is they want to hire just enough people to get the work done. They want to squeeze as much work out of every single employee to make it as efficient for them and as cost effective for them as possible. Now, it's not just a financial expense that a company has to deal with. Let's look at a hypothetical. Let's say somebody left and they were once a department of 6, so now they're down to 5. So that means the workload has increased for those 5 people, but chances are their salaries have not. So now there is a stress on the team to get another person in there. And the longer that stress goes on, more frustrations could build. And then disappointment can come in. And then burnout can come in. And if that happens, then one or more of those remaining people could update their own resumes and look to leave as well. And then the group and possibly the organization can be in real trouble. Aside from the fact of how badly that looks internally, as well as to people interviewing for a role, it also can cost the company money if they can't produce the work in an efficient way. And hiring people takes time. So the longer they wait, the worse it can get for many reasons. There are also other reasons why companies drag their feet. As I mentioned a moment ago, employees are expensive, so they want to be careful that they hire the right person. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where the wrong person is hired and then the company realizes it a few months later, but it is awful. It's a terrible situation because it's really hard to unwind that situation, and the frustration levels can escalate very quickly and now for completely different reasons. Alternatively, even though it's an important decision, sometimes companies are not that efficient and they involve way too many people in the interview process, sometimes 7 or 8 different people who have to interview a single candidate, and some of those people aren't even part of the same department. So it can really become a cumbersome process with 7 or 8 different opinions, and you're trying to get everybody on the same page, and it's really an inefficient way that companies go about it. They, of course, don't all do this, but I've witnessed it, and it takes forever. You leave job seekers hanging. They're actively looking, so they could be interviewing at other places. The decision really should come down to the hiring manager and maybe his or her manager to make the decision, own the decision, and then be accountable for this new person. But it doesn't always work that way. Now, in terms of hiring with using external recruiters, headhunters, interviewing, getting your resume past the online systems, the ATS, the applicant tracking systems, that's for a different podcast, which we'll get into in future episodes. The bottom line is, you as a job seeker, you have a seat at the table. You have to reframe how you look at the job search and realize that you are not at the mercy of whether a company deems you worthy to pass through their doors and work at their company. Good hiring managers have needs. They have business needs and they are looking for good employees. You are that potential employee, and you have skills and experiences that will benefit the company. They don't just get to pick whoever they want. Good companies, the companies that you want to work for, will be very careful about who they select, and that is where you come in. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, this is a business transaction. And the only way a business transaction is successfully completed is when both sides, you and the company, are satisfied. So to wrap this up, remember that companies do not hold all of the cards. They have needs just like you do. You have a lot to offer deserving organizations, and they have their own worries and risks that they are dealing with, and they need you and your abilities. Besides, if they didn't, they wouldn't post a job and they wouldn't spend the money. Part 2, interview questions. I get asked about these 2 questions fairly often. I'm sure you've been asked one or both of these questions in the past. Maybe they make you nervous, maybe they don't. But one of them is, what are your strengths? And the other one is the dreaded, what are your weaknesses? So let's take them one at a time. What are your strengths? All this are business skills that you have that you're pretty good at, according to you. There is no general guidelines for what makes somebody good at something. Just be honest with yourself. You know what you're good at and maybe what needs some working on. For this answer, focus on what you're good at. So for example, customer service skills, managing teams, prioritizing projects or work, negotiating contracts, communication, etc. There are many skills out there. That's just a random sample. For an interview, you want to come to the interview with 3 ready to go, and make sure that all 3 are relevant for the job that you are interviewing for, especially the first example that you give. So here's an example. One of my strengths is cross-functional communication. And I've been a part of many different projects at my current role, and this was really put to the test in the project I just completed successfully, where I had to keep 5 totally different groups up to speed on the project, including supply chain, legal, finance, our creative agency, and sales. I gave them constant updates, and they were absolutely thrilled with how I handled this project that came in on time and on budget. That is one example. And that's really important because anybody can say they're good at cross-functional communication, even terrible communicators. But when you say it and you back it up with an example, that gives that answer credibility. And it also opens the door to possibly more questions about that project that you just mentioned. And that's exactly what you want. Relevant questions about your experience. So then you may get the question, although I don't see it as common, but what are your weaknesses? Or some may even say, what is your greatest weakness, which is ridiculous. Let's just talk about this question for a second. Number one, do not speak about anything personal. This is a job interview. It is a business meeting between you and someone else who you just met. Your personal business, your personal life has no place in this discussion. You were there to talk about your experience and your skills to determine if the company is a fit for you and if you are a fit for them. Number two, the word weakness is a gross overstatement. So when you hear the word weakness from now on in this context, think of a business skill that you have that you could be a little bit better at. That's it. Have a couple prepared and just make sure that whatever the skill is that you're going to talk about isn't a critical skill for the role you're interviewing for, so you don't harm your chances of getting the role. Here are two ways to structure an answer for this question. Number one, you can think of a piece of software that maybe you're not that great at. So for a lot of people, Microsoft Excel is a great example because they simply don't have to use it often. How do you answer that question? Along these lines. Even though I used and continue to use Microsoft Word and PowerPoint often in my current role, Microsoft Excel is one of those programs where I simply don't have to use it, so my skill level is pretty basic. However, over the last month or so, I've been taking courses on YouTube or Udemy or Coursera, and I've been practicing, and I can already say that my proficiency with Excel has improved, and I am much more comfortable with the program than I was during my previous role. That's one, something like that. There are many other programs, Salesforce.com, etc. The list goes on and on. That's one example you can use to answer this question. Another one is public speaking or presenting to a group. This is very common, but if it applies to you, use it. While I'm really good in one-on-one discussions or team meetings or roundtable discussions, I find that I get really nervous when I have to formally present to a group standing in front of the room. And unfortunately, it's one of those areas that I haven't had a chance to do very often. But I've enrolled in a course with Toastmaster, or by practicing at home, I've been able to get better and work past presenting material in that way. The issue isn't whether I know the material, I do. It's just presenting it in a clear and compelling way when standing in front of a group of people, and it's absolutely a skill that I'd like to improve upon. So that's it. You want to answer the question honestly, even though it's not a great question, to then move on to hopefully a better line of questioning from the interviewer. So that's it for this episode. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop me a line at jeffmagnusonconsulting.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the next episode.